Welcome back, Camden Catholic. We're gonna finish up today where we kind of left off in class. We got done talking about how, I guess, ancient Athens society was not acceptable by today's standards in a lot of ways. We talked about the inequality of women in Athens. We talked about the differences in gender roles and sexuality in Athens. We talked about how that does not, they may have been the first Western civilization. This may have been considered classical Greece, but how, ironically enough, parts of their society are much more unacceptable. Now, a lot of people think that all these things happened, it's not acceptable by today's standards, particularly kind of a lot like genetics. Weak traits of societies get kind of dropped as time goes on, right? So, however, there's one thing that didn't get dropped, that is completely held on, and that's the idea of philosophy, right? I absolutely love philosophy, right? Now, speaking of, philosophy means a love of wisdom, okay? Philosophers turned away from the myths and wanted to use logic to explain the natural world, right? Have any of you ever had, I got a better idea, for extra credit for tomorrow, if you bring me into class a philosophical question that you've thought of before, like, for example, what is existence or whatever, you can't use that, but you understand what I'm saying? Like a really, really, really good philosophical question you've ever thought to yourself, bring it in. We'll discuss it a little bit, and we'll try to use logic to explain it, right? So anyway, now, philosophers did turn away from the myths, and they wanted to use the world around them, okay? Now, philosophy means a love of wisdom. Now, there are big three. The big three philosophers, of course, first one is Socrates, right? Socrates was born poor, and he wrote absolutely nothing down. Everything we know about him was written by someone else or by one of his students or observers, right? So he actually created one of the very first schools known as the Forum, right? Now, anyway, or that might have been Aristotle. I'll look that up and I'll get back to you, but I know it was one of the big three. Now, anyway, so he wrote nothing down. He taught completely for free in the Agora, right? He would actually show up at the marketplace and gather people around him and actually discuss different aspects of philosophy and wisdom and using logic to explain why everything's going on the way that it is. So he argued the ideas of existence. He argued the ideas of intelligence, what intelligence really is. He argued the ideas of war. He argued the ideas of everything, right? Because man is a very, ironically enough, unnatural beast. We do things that don't make a lot of sense. War is a very big common one. Why do we fight for the agenda of others, right? So he questioned a lot of these things. What is a good ruler? What's a bad ruler, right? He forced people to really look inside themselves and question themselves as well and realize their own ignorance. So he asked a lot of questions, though. Is also, is perfection possible? Will you ever achieve perfection, right? So that is Socrates. Now, one of the biggest things about him, though, is he came up with the very first method known as the Socratic Method, right? This is where you literally probe a person with nothing but questions until people realize their own ignorance, right? So I will probably end up doing this to one of you tomorrow, but it does frustrate people, and it shows them why they make the choices that they make. That's another question also. Do you really choose anything for yourself? Is anything really up to you, right? So we'll discuss this more tomorrow, though. I love philosophy. Now, also, that's the idea of free will. Do you have free will, right? Now, anyway, let's continue forward, though. His student, one of his main students, was a guy named Plato, right? Now, Plato was born to a very wealthy family, however, was a student of Socrates and was with him in the forum, or with him inside of the Forum a lot of the times, and he actually wrote most of his teachings down. Now, Plato's big three arguments are, he does believe in a utopia, which is the idea of a perfect society, and that you should constantly strive to meet that, and then also he believes that all people are born quote-unquote evil, right? He believes that people are taught to be good. Now, I have my own opinions on this, and we'll discuss this again tomorrow, this big question. Are people born evil and learn to be good, or are people born good and then are taught to be evil, right? So we'll discuss that more tomorrow. The last thing I need you to add underneath this that we'll talk about tomorrow a little bit is his theory of forms, all right? Write that down. Theory of forms, right? Write the theory of forms down, and we'll talk more about that tomorrow. And that's why he believed in the idea of the utopia and trying to achieve a perfect society, right? So let's keep going. And the last big guy is Aristotle, right? Aristotle was actually Plato's student and Alexander the Great's tutor. Now, he believed in this thing called moderation, which is something kind of, he's like the happy medium of the three, right? He taught ethos, logos, pathos. And the thing about that is ethos is ethics and trustworthiness. Logos is using logic to explain everyday like reality. And pathos is using sympathy or caring to be able to communicate with others and actually function in a society properly. Aristotle didn't really necessarily agree with Plato that all people are born evil. He believes more along the lines of society only exists through sympathy, intelligence, and trustworthiness, right? That you can only have a constructed society if you do these things. He also had a lot of ideas about the universe, how it was constructed. He actually was one of the first people to theorize the the heliocentric orbit, that everything goes around the sun. He came up with ideas of the soul and things like that. So we'll talk more about that tomorrow. But anyway, remember, he's one of the big three philosophers. And their impact, the biggest thing about them is they used observation as a way to understand the world and really come to grips with the world around them. This taught us how to think logically and taught us to question whether or not something is assumed to be true or if it's an actual fact, right? These guys are huge because for the longest time, people were listening to these things called oracles that apparently spoke to the gods that weren't there and literally passed off reasons for being the reason why spring exists is because Persephone has come back from the underworld. That's not true. Socrates was the one that argued the reason why spring exists, along with Aristotle, is that the Earth's rotation and the movement causes the duality of the seasons, right? So that's it. Try to bring in a philosophy question tomorrow. We'll talk more about it then. Have a great evening, Camden Catholic.